You all know something, I'm sure, about the human stress response. That's fight, flight, freeze, basically. There are other components of that, but that's what I'm going to emphasize. So, what is the big deal about fight, flight, freeze is that when you are scared, your entire body is on hyper alert, and your brain. So it is a very, very physical experience. And the body, the more it happens, the more the body becomes chronically in that state. Now, the brain is supposed to function in an integrated way. So we're routinely supposed to be, and you are doing it right now, integrating what your body's doing, your sensations you're experiencing, emotions you're experiencing, and your conscious awareness, bringing into what you're integrating, everything you've ever known, heard, learned, all of that is all getting automatically integrated. That's what you all know something, I'm sure, about the human stress response. That's fight, flight, freeze, basically. There are other components of that, but that's what I'm going to emphasize. So, what is the big deal about fight, flight, freeze is that when you are scared, your entire body is on hyper alert, and your brain. So it is a very, very physical experience. And the body, the more it happens, the more the body becomes chronically in that state. Now, the brain is supposed to function in an integrated way. So we're routinely supposed to be, and you are doing it right now, integrating what your body's doing, your sensations you're experiencing, emotions you're experiencing, and your conscious awareness, bringing into what you're integrating, everything you've ever known, heard, learned, all of that is all getting automatically integrated. That's what we all do as the species we are now, all the time. And that's how we remember things. But we don't remember everything, because memory can weather, just normally. So our memories are integrated, they have context, person, place, and thing, but over time, your memory will weather. Come on in. So what we're seeing then, under conditions of trauma, is a loss of integration, the interruption in what is usually the ongoing biographical narrative of your experience. And that's because the brain gets overloaded. Just gets overloaded and can't do its normal functioning. Brain integration developed relatively late in our evolutionary past, and whatever is newest is what's the most vulnerable. So, breathing, digested, really deep. That's what's very similar to all other mammals. So that is the last thing. If our brain is damaged, those are the last functions to go. But the higher functions of consciousness, integration of new information, putting a context, making a biographical narrative, and basically speech, all the speech functions, are the first thing to go when there's neural overload. And that's what happens during a traumatic event to language. Language goes literally offline. So what we see we can't really look at somebody's brain during a traumatic event, but we can look at somebody's brain who's having flashbacks, which are the sudden intrusive recurrence of a piece of a traumatic event. And what we see is that the speech areas that are usually in the left hemisphere just go offline. They're not working. But the sensory areas in the right are still very, very active. Well, so that gets us to the divided brain and how important it is to understand the divided brain. Can you see? Can you see from here? And what connects that divided brain, that left and that right hemisphere, is this structure called the corpus callosum. These are fibers in between our hemispheres that we thought had a real integrated function for us to integrate our minds. But what it looks like what happens when somebody experiences a traumatic event at the moments of peak fear, when language goes offline, there may be some block. We don't know yet exactly what happens in the corpus callosum. But whatever the case, there's a separation between language, which is what gives us context for an event. Time, place, who we're with, is all part of thinking, is all part of language, is all left hemisphere function. Whatever is experienced during the height of fear is in the right brain in the form of images, sensations, strong emotions, but no context. So there's no time code, there's no place code, there's no what the circumstances were or how old was I, or any of that is attached to those fragments of experience. That becomes really, really critically important for why we need the arts so much. So what we end up with, what a trauma survivor ends up with, is very fragmented experience. Memory without a coherent narrative. And we call that traumatic memory. And that is very different than normal memory. Normal memory weathers. Traumatic memory, It is, so that's why somebody can re-experience, get triggered, experience a flashback, have no sense that it's actually something from the past. They feel it as now, happening now, and of course they experience everything that goes along with that. The terror, the horror of all of that happens again and again. So people can get triggered who have experienced this by anything in the environment that their brain happens to make an association to that reminds them of something traumatic from the past. And then they have a flashback. That's what a flashback is. It's a sensory element, a separated sensory element when the original fear is revived and the traumatic moment is re-experienced. And the person has absolutely no control over this. This is brain function. This is really built in from an evolutionary perspective to try to give us reminders, kind of like if you got chased by a lion going down that path, you walk on that path, you smell something, you go, gotta go another way, because my brain just got really scared and I suddenly saw a lion that isn't there and I'm going down the other way. Right, so huge survival value in our original environments, but questionable survival value now. When men are over in Southeast Asia and are in combat, Vietnam vets, right, and come back here and live in Florida and are at a humid, a furry green area and get triggered, that has no survival value for them now. They're not in the same circumstances. The world is entirely different, right? Same for pretty much all of the traumas we could talk about. And then there's the freeze component. So the freeze component of the fight, flight, freeze. So think of a possum that plays dead. That we call dissociation. So dissociation, and during a traumatic event, people have fight, flight, and they usually also dissociate. Why? Because when fear rises to a certain level, your heart rate increases, and it could kill you. You could die. People do die of fright. So instead of dying, your brain automatically goes, I'm going to just go away from here. And there's a disruption in the usually integrative functions of consciousness, memory, identity, or perception of the environment. So it buffers the central nervous system. Incredibly valuable in the short term, hugely problematic in the long term, because Humpty Dumpty doesn't necessarily come back together again spontaneously. The ancestor, the right brain, is really the source of a lot of intuition and creativity, a lot of skill sets that are related to artistic achievement, artistic performance, nonverbal communication, what we value emotionally when our gut tells us something just isn't right, or it's cruel. Nonverbal communication, social interactions, a coherent sense of our body. So our body self is largely right hemisphere, and a unified sense of self. That's really what the right hemisphere specializes in putting things together and keeping them together. Holism. In contrast to the left specializes in language, breaking things into categories, breaking wholes into parts, sequential, rational, logical, speech, reading, writing, computation, skill with numbers, is all dominated by the left hemisphere. Very, very different states of being and states of awareness that ideally, one would think, would work together, would interact all the time. But as we see, that isn't the way the brain has evolved thus far. Important to remember, humans are still evolving. It turns out that the capacities that help us as humans form bonds with other people, empathy, emotional understanding, so on, which involve a quite different kind of attention that we pay to the world, are largely right hemisphere functions. The right hemisphere maintains this highly developed social, emotional, mental system, and it can work independently. There have been surgical experiments done to stop seizures, split brain experiments, where they had people whose right and left brains were still intact but were separated. And what they found is that the right brain can function quite autonomously. If you read Bolt Taylor, I forget her first name, she wrote a book about a stroke of insight. And she had a left brain stroke and then wrote about what it was like to be in a right brain consciousness. It's quite interesting. Well, both hemispheres clearly play crucial roles in the experience of every human being. Both have contributed to our culture. Each, one would think, would need the other, but as you can see from this cartoon, they both got their punching gloves on. The relationship does not appear to be symmetrical. The left hemisphere is actually dependent on, and some people say parasitic on, the right, though it seems to have absolutely no awareness of this fact. So when the right brain is functioning well, it's a source of inspirations, intuition, creativity. But when it strains to make meaning of what it just can't make any sense of, parentheses, trauma, then it becomes a source of illogical emotions, illusions, and delusions that scare the hell out of people. So the fear of madness and loss of control stem from a sense of being overwhelmed by these right brain traumatic images. And the logical left brain function and the self which identifies with it are threatened, and threatened with becoming completely overwhelmed. And so then humans will do anything they can to shut that information down. We will drink, we will do drugs, we will cut ourselves, we will run, we will get involved in violence, we will do all kinds of things just to try to shut down that information because it's so disturbing. And it is in fact disturbing because it's bringing back into trying to get the conscious mind to metabolize this really unmetabolized, horrific stuff. And the earlier that's happened, the more confusing and overwhelming it is because of the state that children are in when those things occur. So the human brain is actually at war with itself. And what McGilchrist says is it follows that they need to cooperate, but they're involved in a power struggle. He believes it helps us understand many aspects of contemporary Western civilization. He does a whole thing about a left brain world, and it sounds chillingly like what we're living through. So the power struggle can be most easily visualized in the symptoms of trauma survivors. To protect the vulnerable but really unknowing left hemisphere, the right hemisphere carries the burden of the past. When I was doing clinical work, I always thought of I didn't know I was thinking about the right hemisphere then, but it was the child inside that was carrying the burden of all the stuff from the past. And both hemispheres exist, however, within one body, one society, one world, so we have to figure out how to get this together. In ceremonial healing, in many, many tribal cultures, probably all tribal cultures, the healing is performed as a ceremony. The ceremony is the main therapeutic agent, and they often perform. They do reenactments of the initial traumas, and often a reenactment of the great myths of the tribe. So to tie things together, integrate one's personal experience with one's group experience. And then the patient is integrated into a healing culture, right? A culture of people who have healed and often become healers themselves. Western culture has much of its origins in the ancient Greeks, so I wanted to look at what they did. And it's really interesting. This author about the prehistory of art says, I often find it difficult when teaching the ancient world to convey a sense of the unity of ancient cultural practices. It wasn't like it is today. In fact, for those of you who are therapists, your term for therapist derives from therapeutes, and these were the attendants of the cult of Asclepius, who was a god. And you had to serve the god by carrying out prescribed rituals. Asclepius, and this is his staff, is a symbol with a snake wrapped around it, is a symbol of medicine even today. He was the god of both healing and the arts in ancient Greek. So they weren't separated. So medicine was an art, and art was medicine. And the worship of Asclepius did not die out until the 5th century AD. So it went on for a really long time. Asclepius is said to have learned healing from Chiron, and Chiron was half man, half beast. So the rational part of learning and the nonverbal, intuitive, less rational part of healing, the beast part. And the part, what you had to do as part of treatment, you had to write a note or a mime, a song, some kind of artistic contribution if you wanted to heal. That was part of the job and part of what Asclepius prescribed for people. And in Athens, the temple of Asclepius was right next door to the theater of Dionysius. And it required a literary production as an offering of thanks because you had undergone some kind of healing. And he was the patron of the arts as well. And the notion was you had to take care of body and soul. They were not separate. Another form of ancient healing, which is very trauma-informed, really interesting, is Trophonius. So you'd go to the priest who worshipped Trophonius, who was the half-brother of Asclepius. And they would have you drink from the fountain of forgetfulness and also from the fountain of memory. And then they'd submerge you in a cave, so there was no light. And you would spend, and they probably gave them some hallucinogens. That's what it's thought. It wasn't just normal states of awareness. They needed to guarantee that something would happen while people were down there having a night of terror. And then they would bring them up the next morning, and they would sit them in the chair of memory, and the patient would have to give detailed accounts of what they had experienced during the night of terror. Everything they'd seen, felt, experienced. They would have to recount it, and of course they'd have to put it into words. They were actually trying, I don't know how many people were re-traumatized and how many people really got better, but clearly what they were aiming at was the integration, putting traumatic experiences into verbal form. And to descend into the cave of Trophonius became a proverbial way of saying to suffer a great fright. And then Jonathan Shea, a colleague of ours, has written about he's a psychiatrist, worked his whole career with Vietnam vets, but also as a Greek scholar. And he believes, and has written about this, that the reason the Greeks created theater was in order to try to integrate combat veterans back into their democratic culture. So if you were a male citizen of ancient Greece, you had to go to battle. And you were young, and you had to go participate in battle. And they were bloody horrible things. And they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, but it was mass destruction. So they'd come back, and they were chronically, they had PTSD basically. And they were not therefore fit to participate. You couldn't, if you wanted to have a really good dialogue and debate in the Athenian Senate, you couldn't leap across and try to kill the person with an opposite point of view. So he believes they created theater in order to help people to heal. That the combatants would be in the role of the dramatic characters in the Greek plays, and the chorus would be the adolescents who had not yet gone to battle. And they would represent the integrity that the combat veterans once had and needed to get back to. And then we know that poetry came before prose. It's a historical fact. Prose was at first seen as pisos logos, literally meaning pedestrian or walking logos, as opposed to the dancing logos of poetry. And then dance. Dance is the communication of meaning through movement. It's in every culture. It requires an ability to weave together the physical, the emotional, and intellectual aspects of one's understanding, as dancers know. They're not just going through a routine, it's the whole being is being expressed. So why do the arts matter? And I'm getting through. I'm getting close. To summarize what I think is really going on, that the traumatic nature of our evolutionary history necessitated us developing adaptive coping skills, but the result is fragmentation and the loss of integrated functioning, and that becomes intergenerational. We pass that on as normal then from generation to generation. I believe the post-traumatic effects are the unfortunate consequence of emergency measures aimed at helping us to survive, and that there is no other innate mechanism residing solely within the individual that ensures reintegration. So it ain't going to be there. It's going to depend on other people. The result, however, is that survivors of trauma, they fall into a black hole. Within which the light of awareness of peace and of wholeness is really just absorbed. It's like the way they describe black holes in the universe. The key to unlocking that black hole of trauma is understanding the multiple effects of trauma across the lifespan, and then utilizing the brain's integrated function with our creativity to self-heal, all within the context of our social groups, that we are vastly interdependent. Artistic performance in all its variations is our primary integrating mechanism in an organism highly susceptible to the protective but ultimately destructive mechanism we call dissociation. I believe that it is in the evolved development of our mimetic response to other people that we have to look for some answers, and in our capacity to define cultural reality through ritual, belief system, meaning-making, and all the forms of art that we can delineate the keys to individual and group healing. I think artistic performance is that bridge across the black hole of trauma. It's the evolved individual and group response to what is in fact the tragic nature of human existence. Václav Havel's one of my heroes, and he said every work of art points somewhere beyond itself. It transcends itself and its author It creates a special force field around itself that moves the human mind and the human nervous system. One way of helping people is by reminding them that the time is getting late, that the situation is grave, that it can't be ignored. Seeing the outlines of horror induces the will to face up to it. And Marcuse said, if art cannot change the world, it can help to change the consciousness and drives of the men and women who would change the world.